Okay, cool. Hello and welcome to the Game Factory podcast. This is episode three, which is about life after launch of a game. So the last time I really launched a game, there wasn't really life after launch of the game. It was kind of you shipped a thing and you hope people liked it. And I guess some of the downsides of that, I mean, lots of downsides of that. If you had bugs in there, you couldn't patch it. It was just kind of stuck there. Actually, I'm lying. I guess Little Big Planet did have loads of patches and DLC.
I was going to say, like, Little Big Planet had, like, more
Yeah,
DLC than
that's
any game in
actually
history.
true. Yeah,
Yeah,
but when I
right.
started,
Including some Thomas Was Alone DLC. There you go.
hey, yeah, Twitter's good for something. But yeah, so you had to live with your, I guess PS2 era. You had to live with your bugs. Because you weren't, doing anything different, the press was kind of done with you at launch, and I think because of that, you ended up with a state where your sales were sort of just a long tail, but you couldn't really get any spikes. And obviously, things are very, very different now, and both of you have recently launched games. So I want to talk about how different things are now, and obviously some of the abilities are different, but is the net result that different? So let's start talking about updates. I guess both of you have done, updates to your games already. How do you sort of evaluate whether you should be doing new updates at all?
So in my case, it really is. It's always a pros and cons thing. It's always like there's always something you always want to add stuff. Like no game developer in the world wants to ever finish a video game because there's always new stuff you want to put in. But it's always a risk because every time you add something, you create a million new bugs. Not a million, that's a slight exaggeration, but like there's a real risk. And especially when you know that like people have paid for your thing and they're now enjoying that, like any act of going in and changing something, it's a risk. It's like if a mechanic side just coming around your house and tinkering with your car every night to make it better. Like that would annoy you. So for me, it's always weighing those up. In Volume's case, like, the first update was we had this massive problem with our checkpointing system that was just making the game not fun for a lot of people. So that was kind of just a no-brainer. We have to fix this. Got that done in a week. And then since then, it's just been kind of bug fixing and then working on bigger updates that will come down the river. But I think there's a distinct difference there of kind of patches effectively that are kind of fixing bugs and updates which are adding content. So I guess you want to talk more about the kind of the content stuff necessarily than the bug side, right?
I imagine in the long run that'll be more interesting, but I think they're both actually worth talking about because I think one of them is more required, but there's much less fanfare about. But I'll let Andrew talk about his thought process for Tango because I think things are kind of different in that you've probably been in the same mentality since you guys were on early access. So is it just carrying that momentum forward, or is there a different thought process now that it's properly launched?
So yeah, it's a very well sort of thought out question because you'd think absolutely what you were saying. We would just sort of carry on with the sort of habitual updating that we did with early access, and to a certain extent, like Mike was saying there, pros and cons, weighing up what you should and shouldn't address or fix or add has been something that we've been doing for just like over a year. So we carried that on, but then because of the economics of the situation, we're not selling particularly brilliantly. I think nobody's selling particularly brilliantly at the minute. But it meant that we couldn't really justify carrying on the same really aggressive schedule. So what we've done is basically just sort of slow down, and we took about 3 weeks, excuse me, to sort of let the emotion settle, let the dust settle of the launch, and just see actually what was most sensible to follow up on. And that's a mixture of people on the forums, people at shows, reading through the reviews and the feedback, although that's usually for more feature-driven stuff than it is patches. Just trying to make sensible decisions. I think it's very easy to storm in and, like Mike was saying, you've got maintenance, but what the fun bit is adding features and making the game what you wished it was, maybe, or whatever it might be. So we've been doing some maintenance, and we've been planning quite a big chunky update. I think that we'll probably go on to this later, but I think that the fact that we haven't had like a massive response to the game yet means that we're able to do that. I think if there had been a massive response, we'd be a much more sort of interesting week-to-week situation, at least.
I guess in what sense do you mean that if there's loads of people playing it, you're much more afraid of breaking things, or do you mean
a little bit
else?
of that, yeah. Like,
and also, I guess you'd feel more justified doing bigger updates quicker, right? That you'd be rushing to try and kind of.
I think so. Like, it might even be that we would be so busy fixing things. I mean, there's quite a large unknown in terms of the volume. There you go, plugged it. Of sort of.
if we mention it every 5 minutes, that'd be great. Otherwise I'm going to leave. That's contractually obligated.
There's a large amount of data to be gathered from players, but we haven't hit a point where we've got enough that we're confident making like statistical insight. So what we're doing is very much based on gut feel and sort of written and videoed feedback that we've got. So it's a bit more organic. I think if there'd been more people, we'd have been a lot busier. Obviously, with maintenance and things, I think there's probably a lot of bugs that haven't been found yet. But that's Mr. Cynical sort of producer hat saying that. I think it would be we'd be very, very tight on sort of combining probably like weekly maintenance updates with like, you know, every fortnight a new feature or something that's been requested. And that could be, I mean, for me, Mike and Mo, I don't know how you kind of think about it, but for me, maintenance is literally bug fixing, and then anything that's additional, even down to like more configuration like options and things, is actually a feature thing. So because it can be quite small things, it can be quite big things, I guess.
I mean, that was our experience with Volume, is because Volume's doing really well, which is nice, but we found ourselves in a very different kind of situation where the maintenance, like I think we were pushing out updates, I want to say every kind of 2 to 3 days, like for the first couple of weeks, and then kind of that slowed a little bit, mainly because we just stopped finding major bugs. There are still definitely bugs in Volume. It's not a bug-free game, but like the big scary ones got cleaned up. But because we're also on console, that adds a really interesting wrinkle to feature updates, because there's a lot of process to go through to get an update onto. And I think people, you know, with Steam, if me or Smithy decides like we want something in our game, that can be in the game within the next quarter of an hour live on Steam, and that would, you know, for better or worse, probably not a good thing for us to rush that in. Whereas with PlayStation, there are these processes, and you have to go through new QA rounds at Sony. There's sometimes there's like financial, like you have to actually pay them to do updates and stuff like that. That varies as well, though. So for us, what we've settled into with Volume is, now that we've kind of cleared all the big, scary, noisy bugs, we're focusing more on big updates that add cool new things, but spacing those out kind of quite significantly, just because every time we want to do an update to PlayStation, we have to jump through a lot of hoops, and it makes no sense for us to kind of do lots of interim updates and then push one big one, because that introduces a lot of bugs and makes things very messy. So that's what we've settled into, which is very different to, like, you know, having with Thomas, we were on PC first, and it was great because we didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. We could rush very quickly. It's a very different thing when you're on console. So that's what we're doing. So we're doing kind of more substantial things, and then we're actively doing like a big DLC. That's our big kind of thing that's coming out. Next year is the official line on PlayStation VR whenever it comes out. So that's what we're kind of building towards, is like a very specific, like a lump of content, saying like these hours of content, this is a new edition. So it's a bigger update later.
Yeah, it's interesting, like what you said of, you know, how you guys consider how big a chunk to do and so on and so forth. And one of the big concerns is QA and then bug fixing, and, you know, are you creating more bugs than you're doing? But do you guys ever think of it from an ROI perspective of, like, you know, return on investment of, like, is it going to bring this many more sales if I do this update, or, you know, that kind of thing?
You really have to. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, like, we all have our own bills to pay, and then like the bills for everyone who works for us. So that has to factor in. It has to be at some level about the business of it. But that's also timing. It's not just like how much can we do. it's when's the best time for us to add stuff. When are people going to be looking? When's the time that is best for us to add something to the game that might get people talking about the game again? Is it right now when the game's full price, or is it in X number of weeks when it's in a sale, or when we know that we're going to be getting coverage for something else, or so there is that thing as well of when to deploy the update to kind of get the best ROI. Gamers rightly don't give a crap about this, but unfortunately, we have to.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I think the perception, Andrew mentioned earlier, there's sometimes you just put out a little tweak or something, and it's like, as developers, because it's not a lot of work, we immediately question is it valuable, is it not? But I'm working on a live mobile game right now, and it's just like little tweaks are some of the biggest things that players care about. You'll have the community up in arms over one issue, and then you just we changed this number, or we rebalance this little thing, and it actually has a huge impact. The last I'm trying to think of the last time I actually didn't update anything. It was actually on Ring Fling. It was selling surprisingly well and getting a lot of coverage in Germany. And I was at WWDC, and I met this this girl there that was like a German developer, and she was just like, I saw videos for this and it's cool, but she's just like, but you need to make it for the German audience. And I was like, what do you mean make it for the German audience? And she's like, have you ever seen a German washing machine? I'm like, no, I don't live in Germany. She's just like, imagine American washing machine with 100 more knobs on it. Just like you can, fine tune everything I want, this exact precise temperature, whatever. And she was just saying the people in Germany, when they make a game, they want an option screen. It's almost like Total Biscuit-esque of they want to be able to tweak all these things and, make sure they can do that kind of stuff. And it actually did have, a significant effect in my sales in Germany. It just seemed like a kind of a small thing to me of just, there's a bunch of stuff that I already tuned myself, just expose it to the player. And
it's weird, isn't it, though? Because we added one of our updates was to add Russian to volume, and it's now... It's one of the biggest markets for the game right now, because it's selling really well in Russia because we actually have served that audience, and it's very easy to assume that the entire world speaks English and all read the same games websites as we do, but there's this whole other country, all these other continents and countries that are really interesting if we make stuff for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what we said about value perception, and that player value perception is often very different from developer value perception. But one of the big questions is, when can you pay for updates, or when can you ask players to pay for updates?
I'm going to let Smithy answer this one first, and then I'm going to come in as the Robin Hood.
I'm going to clue. I mean, it's this thing. So right now we're really in a position where we can almost do anything we want, but so we're not trying to get a return on investment at the minute, because it's just not a realistic thing. We're trying to figure out how to change the game so that it begins to get a return on investment, if that makes sense. So we're not seeing we're not thinking about our update in terms of adding to what's already there. We're trying to change what's there in a fundamental way, because for whatever reason it didn't chime with people. And so we're going to do a free update, absolutely, because we're kind of we're kind of thinking of it as, well, this is how it maybe should have been if we'd known what we know now. And it's just to sort of clarify what we mean by a big update, it's we're adding a whole new game mode. We're adding an awful lot of updates to things like progression and reasons to keep playing, and there's quite a lot of gameplay content, not necessarily art and stuff, which would be maybe what we'd be doing if we were this game's selling well in, I don't know, Sweden. What's a famous 80s Swedish action hero? Let's do something based on that, whatever. That would be a simple sort of a thing. But or similarly, Mike was saying earlier, timing it. We were considering doing a chunky sort of maybe a Die Hard update for the winter sale. Again, we were hang on, we don't actually know that that's adding more of what is already there, and at the minute we're not sure if that's what people want. So that would be crazy to do that this year. But yeah, I mean, we're looking at the trends and stuff, and it seems like most people expect free.
Yeah.
unless it's meaningfully different in terms of like, I don't even know the best word for it. I was going to say like aesthetic, but that's not it. It's like if you had a story-based game and then you introduced a new character with a whole new story, you could do paid content, even if like technically there's not a lot of new content, because the percentage of what is new is really foregrounded, right? It's really obvious. Whereas you could do a whole systemic like rebranding, like just all kinds of wonderful things. If it's slightly hidden, then people won't perceive it quite as big a value, perhaps. And it's an interesting kind of area at the minute. You see what a lot of free to play games are doing as free updates, obviously, and it's just like I'm not sure how other games can compete. You know, it's
we had a really interesting conversation about this because sorry, we're with Coda, which is the VR version. We are doing exactly what Smithy's describing in terms of we're adding a new character. I just finished doing all the VO recordings, like whole new story stuff, whole new it's a big substantial chunk of content. And of course, this conversation comes up where you're like, this is like a third of a game here. Like this is a substantial chunk of stuff. Ultimately, we decided free because the audience have been really nice and supportive, and we kind of want to give them cool stuff. But also, like, just because I'm not convinced in the indie space that we need to necessarily go back to the same people for their money again. Like, if someone's a fan, like, obviously, like, cool stuff external, like going back to them with, you know, a cool, I don't know, soundtrack or making of book or something different and interesting. But like in terms of that core game experience, there just doesn't seem to be a cap at our scale, because we're not selling on the unit numbers that the kind of the AAAs are, and we have this kind of evergreen status. You know, Thomas Was Alone still sells about as well as Thomas Was Alone has always sold. Like, just because there's always new people coming out. It's not that the game's amazing. It's not that people are buying 5 copies of it for themselves. It's because there is not, you know, there is a cap in terms of the number of players out there who want Thomas Was Alone, but it doesn't seem like it's ever going to be something. We're too small that we can't see it. It's like an ant doesn't give a shit about seas. There you go. There's a bleep for you on the,
Thanks,
on the
Mike.
podcast. You're welcome. Like, because the ant's tiny, right? And it's not going to get there ever in its life, so it doesn't matter. And I feel that way about indie at the scale that Thomas was, and I assume Volume will be. We're off to a better start, but I don't see it like it's not going to go absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like bringing in. I would rather get $20 from a new player buying the game because they've heard about it because it's got all this cool content, than I would go back to someone who's already given me $20 and ask them for $5 more or $10 more or whatever. It feels like expansion of the audience is a better objective.
Got it.
But it varies, and if you're Call of Duty, you have to charge because you've already sold Call of Duty to most of the world's population.
Yeah.
There's no new players who you're going to invite in by putting this content out there. So you kind of have to. But yeah, I don't think it's always the selfless act to give away a free update that the community necessarily assumes it is.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting when you sort of look at the indie space. I can't think of many, or if any, indie games that I've bought, you know, additional content for or anything like that.
Well, even Minecraft, right? Like, that's the biggest indie game ever, and even they still keep selling. Like, even they're not capping out. So
yeah. I mean, another thing that you just mentioned is sort of that long tail. Like, you know, I when people used to talk about that sales curve, I used to think like, oh, you know, it's this curve and it just ends up at 0 and so on and so forth. And
it's like this, right?
Yeah, but it's really surprising that it doesn't, because even, you know, a little tiny thing like Ring Fling, like when it came out, I was like, oh, this is disappointing. Like, you know, this has dropped to like 10 sales a day, and, you know, that kind of sucks. And then when it stayed at 10 sales for 2 years, and it's like 10 sales a day over 2 years actually adds up to be, you know, plenty to sort of cover the cost that I originally spent on it. And so when I was doing updates, I just thought, you know, you know, as a mobile game that's $2, I'm not going to get any more money out of anyone. It's not like I can ask for 50p or 20p or something. But yeah, it was really interesting to see that tail. But one thing, obviously, that now we can affect what that tail looks like is sales. So what have your experiences been with, you know, sales on your games?
I mean, in my case, like every sale I do, there was a period, definitely, like Thomas Was Alone, like I guess for the first 6 months to a year, where because we were starting off with, well, I mean, the first sale I did on Thomas was 2 months after its Steam release for 50% off, which was not necessarily the smartest play.
Yeah. Is that why you got a business guy?
That's why, one of the many reasons. He wasn't there in 2012. So you know, and that sale did well, and then 75% off did better, and then I think at one point I did like 90% off or whatever, and that did about the same. And now with Thomas is like clockwork. Thomas always makes the same amount of money in a sale. Yeah. I make if I put the number lower, then I sell more copies in perfect. Like it's scarily mathematically the same. Like there is an amount of money that Thomas Was Alone makes in every day of every sale. Volume is off to a good start with that, which is interesting because Volume's obviously a much more expensive game, but is already massively outperforming what Thomas has done historically. So I'm intrigued to see how Volume goes, because Volume is doing really well in those sales, but it's kind of, I'm intrigued to see if that's going to go up, because so far it's trending upwards.
Yeah.
How far up it's going to go, because it will at some point inevitably kind of hit that plateau like Thomas did, where it's like, this is how much Thomas sells, you know.
Yeah.
But like you say, it's you're playing over a long period, you know. I think I feel like there's a bunch of indies now who don't realize that this is how we all did stuff.
Yeah.
Like you hear people talking about like the first 2 months of a game's sales and whatever, and it's like, no, that's not how, like, you have, you know, 3 or 4 games a year which come out and have an amazingly mega massive launch and then kind of slide off. But most of us historically have always kind of kept going and slowly built over time, which is stable, less exciting, less sexy, but it's what pays the bills.
What about you, Andrew?
Well, yeah, I don't really know. I mean, we've had, during early access, we had sales on the game. It was selling at a general like a couple of quid cheaper than we were aiming for RRP. Yeah. We did a launch sort of discount in the launch week.
Yep.
And what seems to happen with Tango was that we increased our piracy rate massively after the sale was off.
Yep.
That's really interesting.
By about 1,000%.
Wow.
So your word of mouth from the sale was basically getting people to pirate the game rather than buy it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. and then sales pretty much fell off a cliff and have been sat at very few every day. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next sale we're involved in. I don't know, like, you know, whether it's going to be the same sort of percentage increase as the launch one was. Certainly compared to the weeks leading up to early access, up to launch, with the sale, the launch week was good, but because it was the launch week,
it's two things combined.
Yeah, so it's hard to tell. But yeah, we're aiming for sort of the new year for the first big update, and we'll see sort of hopefully, you know, some useful information. But I mean, the experience so far has not been, like I say, it's been in line with what everyone seems to think is normal now.
Yeah.
But what all the examples we read about are not describing.
Yeah.
So there is certainly like some kind of new challenge, and I'm not sure anyone knows what it is at the moment.
Have you put any thought into what you attribute, you know, the fact that people see your game and are interested in it, but then they go to pirate instead of buy it? Have you thought at all about that psychology, or?
I mean, yeah, I don't really know. I mean, traditionally, broad strokes, I'm of the opinion that a pirate download is not a lost sale. You know, I still think that's the case, that people will just, you know, they'll have heard of it, which is good, and they'll go and download it. That's fine too, I guess. But then they were never going to go and pay the money for it. It's not like they get a page with the 2 links. One's free.
I was going to pay for this, but I've just heard it's available on a BitTorrent. I'm going to go and absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that's pretty much it. So, like, I guess, it's really confusing, and we're not really sure what's going on there. And we've taken some steps to sort of try and combat it a little bit, just so that the little data we're getting is a bit more accurate. You know, we were very confused for a couple of weeks until we realised that these aren't sales, these are just new users, and it's like, right, okay.
Yeah. I know what that means. Yeah. Interesting. And I guess, sort of related to sales, have you guys had any experience with bundles, and what are your opinions and experiences of how that went?
I mean, I basically live in Humble Bundles. It goes into what King Bobsky actually asked a question and is now asking about Humble Bundle. He doesn't know that we're about to go on to this topic. He's sat there waiting for his question to be answered. But he asked about, do Steam sales have an impact? For me, that's the great success of bundles. Is bundles are visibility. You know, people massively. I think there's an assumption that they've devalued things a little bit, but I think actually the opposite's true. I think the big bundles, things like Humble Bundle, actually put you on the map and give a scale of visibility. Thomas Was Alone. I mean, it's on the public record. Thomas Was Alone has sold, I want to say 750,000 units in Humble Bundles at this point, because it's just been in so bloody many of them.
Yeah.
But what that does is, yes, obviously that's a nice bit of money that you make from doing that. But more importantly, that made Thomas Was Alone a thing that people had heard of. It gave people an awareness of Thomas Was Alone that no amount of YouTubers or reviews would have done. It made Thomas Was Alone a game that people just know about.
Yeah.
And I think as something on a life cycle of a game, Humble Bundle's really useful and important. I definitely think that Humble Bundle and things like it are the reason that Thomas is still selling. It just creates that visibility. I would say that I don't think any other bundle company makes sense financially to be a part of at the moment, because I think as well that people should be careful. One specific thing that I've been hearing from a few devs about is people bundling games in Greenlight. To get so if your game's in Greenlight, you get there's certain bundling companies who will remain nameless who approach those indies and go, hey, if you go in our bundle, we'll a stipulation of the bundle is people have to vote for you on Greenlight, so we'll get you through Greenlight. The problem then is that you've basically made the value of your game 10 cents before you're even out there. So that's kind of hurt a lot of people. So I would say bundling makes sense as long as it's a humble bundle. I think other ones kind of don't quite make financial sense right now.
Yeah, and I'd never heard of that Greenlight thing, and it's a little bit terrifying to me. We're going completely off topic. I apologize, but it's terrifying to me because maybe it's naive of me, but I see Greenlight as an opportunity to say, look, here's this thing I'm making. Give me feedback on whether you like it or not. Because if you do like it, I'll continue making it and put more effort into it. And if you don't like it, I need to think about that. And if it's to the point where it's just like, well, I just want votes, I don't care about what you think of the game, I think it's just a dangerous investment of my money. I definitely want to be sort of in a path where the more confident I am in the game, the more money I'm willing to put into it, rather than I'm just going to chuck a bunch of money at it.
That's because you have humility, Mood. That's your big mistake. That's what's going to hold you back in the world of game development, is you don't think you're a genius. No, you're absolutely right. I think if you look at Greenlight like that, with an awareness that Steam is not the magic money funnel they used to be. I mean, those days are gone. I think that's the thing, is I think a lot of people go onto Greenlight and they've run out of money basically, and they're terrified and they just need to get something out. They're in incredibly difficult situation, and I understand desperation in that scenario. It makes perfect sense that you would be worried or scared. And I think if you go into Greenlight the way you're describing, I think it's a very useful tool. But I think that it's also I think people still think Valve release just means you will make loads and loads of money.
Yeah, sorry. I apologize for the weird faces I'm making, but my cat is attacking my microphone.
I was wondering what was going on. Am I talking? Am I being really stupid right now?
It's just swinging around like crazy. I apologize if it's making any crazy noises, but that's what she does.
There's occasionally a scary shadow just kind of comes in. From
just creeps over. Yeah, sorry. As to get back on track. So another thing that I think updates and sales and that kind of thing are really good for is trying to get, as you guys said, it's really good to combine those two things together to try and also get a press pickup. I guess I'll let you guys talk about, does that strategy make sense? Just always put everything you can together in one thing, because it's all about making, a big impact and coming up over the, water level a bit.
I got a bit confused by the question there. Smithy.
Well, I'll go for it. So with the update that we're planning for Tango Fiesta, it's like it's a response to the fact we didn't get over that hump before. So we're like, right, here's where we think it went wrong, or we could do better, and hopefully we're going to bundle that all into something that makes sense. So we're going to try and sort of, it's not really a relaunch, but that's how we're kind of, I guess, approaching it. So yeah, like as you said, we're not going to really drip feed too much out there. There might be things that we're like, oh, we've fixed something on the way, and it's just like we might as well, you know, because the existing players will appreciate it. But broadly, it's very much like here is a refresh, and hopefully just a big lump of content that excites people, gets people talking about it. And yeah, I mean, we're fortunate in that, like you're saying, the games are always on Steam, they're always selling, and we're looking at the fact that we didn't get like well, I'm exaggerating. We got very little coverage on our launch. I was going to say none whatsoever, but that was
really didn't. I remember being surprised.
We got like a big fat ignored. So we're like, well, that means at least that next time nobody can turn around and say, well, we've already covered you, like your old news or whatever, you know, like maybe there was some of, like, we're just trying to like eliminate every option to not talk about us, and then make them talk about us, essentially. So it's you know, we're very fortunate enough, like the game itself, like we'll go on to like measuring success I think a bit later, but like it's not success for us wasn't that it would fund itself, and it's not doing that, but we're fortunate enough that we can. So like it must be different for people who struggle and don't have like a backup, if you like, and conversely as well, like for I mean, Mike, this is a massive assumption and do correct me if I'm wrong, but like it seems like you're in a position where you could kind of like the volume gamble paid off enough that you can like, let's follow up with that, let's push it a little bit further and a little bit further, like ratcheting it a little bit.
I mean that's the situation we're in. Is I mean we've been a bit more lucky because I guess we were very lucky with our coverage at launch and done very well across the board, which is lovely. But it means that volume's done well to a level where I feel comfortable putting more money into it, which is that's a very difficult thing to gauge. But certainly with volume, like it feels like something to continue investing in. So we're gonna keep adding stuff and yeah, the VR version is honestly, the VR version came about because I'm really into VR. And from a business point of view, it made way more sense to do a DLC for an existing thing rather than run off for like a couple of years and make a VR thing with no experience and see what worked. It made sense to kind of do something smaller. So but that was lucky. And that's always the thing I always try and come back to with people is this industry, games flop. It happens. Touch wood, not happened for a little while to us, but it will at some point. We'll have that scenario play out, and you just got to be prepared for it when it happens.
So with the Coda, with Coda's content, how did you, like, obviously it's like a fairly discrete chunk of game. I mean, is it different enough that it is a whole game? Was there any of it that you wanted to kind of maybe put it out between now and that launch, you know, because with Tango it's sort of putting on what's there very literally, but
I mean we have I mean the other factor in this of course is that Coda is very, very specific. It's so it's so it's specific to a specific audience. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. It loses it's for VR only, so that means that there's a lot of players who would be like, well, why am I not getting an update for 3-4 months or whatever? So basically we're doing what you're describing. The stuff that's kind of in the trunk of volume that kind of all plays across between the two, we'll get those kind of pushed into the main versions. But then the content is the thing with the VR, and of course all the VR specific kind of gubbins. But the stuff we're ticking off on the way, that we're, you know, the checkpoints were one part of that, but there's other things that we want to fix in the game in order to get that VR version good. Those will go into the main version as we go along. But it's very much pushing in that one direction.
Cool. I mean, one question I have is just genuinely curious, just because I haven't gone, dealt with the press that much lately. If you're not covered initially, does it ever get easier? Like if it's, something they're not interested in initially, is it just, the right thing at the right time, or is it just, they're not interested or that kind of thing? Like I know, Andrew, you're saying you're trying to do a second launch, and, there might be sites that, may or may not have covered you the first time around. But I guess sort of what do you think is like the best strategy to just continue going on? Like, do you think there's actually, just a lot of sites that are kind of like, well, we're really busy at that point. This is, a better opportunity, or?
So this is couched in having just had a very negative experience with it. So this is why we've got both me and Mike, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Particularly useful. So this is like the downside, I suppose. So from our point of view, I think some people just like it's not like the right time because there's lots of big games coming soon, and I mean I'm pretty sure people have been playing a lot of the big releases for a while. I think we should have been early enough to beat that, to be honest. So it's a bit of a question mark. It's not a definite down, but it's a question mark. We've had a couple of the bigger sites pretty explicitly say that they just not interested in indie titles and covering them. That's worrying because what the hell's an indie title? I'm pretty sure it doesn't count. Like I'm pretty sure anything like Vlambeer does will get covered. By the sites in question, but we don't get covered, and a lot of other people don't get covered. And then beyond that, it's like, well, where do you get covered? Like if the big guys aren't like taking notice, then they're not. It's a big cumulative effect, and if you're missing a couple of the big like nodes of sites, then you're cutting off like tons of smaller ways that your game can get noticed as a result of it. So that's a worry, and I'm not sure why or if that will change in the future. It might just get worse. And then, I mean, moving away from the press, I guess we've got YouTubers and streamers and, the other ways that a game can be covered. And I don't know, personally, we're sort of ramping up on that a little bit. We're trying to, we've got some contacts, and we've just been lucky enough to be at various game shows and introduce ourselves to people. That's how it's done. And we're basically approaching that like we used to approach the press. Which is you start with the people who are small enough to give a shit when no one's heard of your game, and then you use those to build up sort of legitimacy, if you like, with the bigger guys, and hopefully that's going to work. I'll let you know. If we do, season 2 of this podcast, I'll probably come around and I'll have some answers. I mean, that's sort of the frustration at the minute, is there's a lot of like question marks and like, well, this didn't happen, and it's really hard to tell why. It's a lot easier to tell why something did happen. It's like, well, because I know that guy and I emailed him. That's why that happened. But yeah, it's been an interesting time.
It's I mean I can only speak. I mean, this is the problem I have, is that like Volume obviously launched with a great deal of press because I'm one of those arseholes, right? Like I'm someone who has that whatever reputation, enough Twitter followers, I guess, whatever the line is.
But I think one of the important parts is you bring clicks, right? It's just like
and I think that's definitely a factor. God knows why. I'm not very interesting, but like that's like, so for me, Volume was like no problem. We got reviews everywhere. We got Metacritic. It's just. I remember with Thomas that people think Thomas Was Alone came out significantly later than it actually did. We very much, it was a build, and like I think at launch Thomas Was Alone got like 2 reviews, 3 reviews, maybe something like that. So it definitely used to be the case that you could be discovered, but I suspect now it's just the case that like there's a new indie game coming out every 5 minutes, so probably the press are gonna start like not being as interested in discovering stuff, and it's tough. It's tough. I don't have. I wish I knew the answer. I feel like I'm benefiting from the reputation that's happened over the last few years. Yeah. I have
So-
no advice or thoughts on this, but it's a very long way of saying I have no opinion on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we'll probably dive in a bit about, how competitive is an indie at this point, because I think that is sort of, the elephant in the room. But let's just talk a little bit about like when do you decide that you're sort of done with working on a game, done with, whether it's promoting it, whether it's doing updates, whatever. I guess what is that sort of thought process to you, to either of you, really?
I think it's the ROI thing. I think on a cynical level, like it's basically what's the point where this isn't worth our time anymore, or where we don't think that we're going to significantly improve the financial side of it by doing updates.
Yeah.
It's like Thomas Was Alone. Like I did one DLC for that. It was exclusive to PlayStation, and then we brought it across once we were allowed to. And like that was it. Like beyond like bug fixing. Like, because, I'm not going to, if I put out an update for Thomas Was Alone now, no one's going to care. It's not going to, it's not going to make a difference. It's going to do exactly as it's already doing.
Yeah.
That for me is the cutoff. Is basically if I can spend $1 to make 2, then I'll probably do it. But it's the other thing I think as well with indie stuff is a lot of its availability of time. So like, we're obviously starting on a bunch of other projects as well. So, there's going to be a point where I'm too busy on the next thing to be able to do this on volume. If it's at a point where it makes sense to hire someone to do that, that might be something we look into. But like, it's really is just like do I have the time, and is it going to be justified financially?
I guess like after 3 years, you'd basically be doing a sequel. If you were to,
I'd be better off
like,
releasing a
reinvest
Thomas Was Alone sequel. Exactly.
Yeah, rather than an update. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's I guess there's like this industry is more split than it has been, and it's down broadly. Game as a service, or as I like to think of it, as a hobby, really, versus like one-off lumps of game. So yeah, I think. In the past, it's been very different. In my experience, I mean, in my career, it's literally been like, let's just bash out games until one hits. Like that's been sort of the method for Spilt Milk. Before then, when we were working at other companies, it was very much the decision was probably the same, but it was in someone else's hands. And that's one of the things that you learn when you move to like from normal video games land into being an independent studio or whatever, or at least maybe even just getting promoted into management. You suddenly realize that all these decisions do get made. These are not news decisions. These are not like new techniques. It's stuff that's been going on forever. It's just that if people have been successful enough to make a ton of money, they've probably ended up being a publisher eventually, and that's there's like a layer of obfuscation from it. So it seemed like games would get cancelled and sequels ordered on a whim, but it's always basically a ROI question, isn't it? And an amount of time between, like when you can get that investment back. I guess the main difference is that like the cycle, like how quickly you can return like to a title and update it and expand an audience, or the time it takes for you to realize that it's not worth it. You can actually be very nice and quick.
And availability, I think, makes a big factor here. The idea that a game could feasibly, like Thomas Was Alone, could do well in its a few months after release. Whereas in the old days, you put something on a shelf. If it's not selling, it's not going to be on that shelf in a matter of weeks. So I think that also factors in there.
Yeah.
Cool. I guess chat, please start posting questions while we're going to start talking a little bit about how tough it is to be indie. I mean, obviously, I announced my new indie studio last week, and hearing everything I hear around, it's kind of terrifying. So I'll let you guys fill me in on what I have to look forward to.
Well, just a lot of hard work, but you knew that already.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously the chart that I always see everywhere is, the number, the total revenue spent on Steam is about the same. The number of developers or the number of games released is going up. So obviously the average revenue per game, is going down. Like that's just a mathematical truth. But, when I sort of think about it, and I look at projects, I guess it seems as hit or miss as it always was.
Yeah, it's not. I don't think it's changed. Like, I think there's basically, like, in terms of stuff that gets onto Steam and then doesn't like sell at all.
Yeah.
I think that's just, those are just games that wouldn't have got on Steam a few years ago. And in terms of the bigger stuff, the stuff that sells, like, yeah, I'm seeing exactly the same balance of games. Like, I'm seeing exactly the same, like, 4 or 5 kind of mega hits every year, and then kind of the middle classes, I guess, which is where I am at, where, you know, we make X amount. I think as well, like, people assume that we made a lot more money back in the day than we actually did. I think that's certainly a factor in it. Like, that middle class kind of goes along, and then, you know, there's people kind of struggling, but then every now and again those people create something that goes crazy. So you know, we've seen that certainly with a few indie games this year that no one was doing any coverage of before launch, but came out of nowhere and did awesome stuff. So I think I don't feel it's changed, but then I'm in an incredibly privileged position, so maybe I'm blind to the realities. What do you think, Smithy?
I was going to disagree a little bit, naturally.
Of course. It makes it interesting.
Cool. I do agree, like, obviously, with what both of you are saying. I just think that now there are more, like, one of the things that I don't think is talked about very much about the fact that Steam's opened up, and just, you know, as a result, so has, you know, generally games and ways of selling them and all that stuff on every platform. The fact that everyone's like, oh, there's like a flood, and everyone, like, you know, it's this idea that there's all this great content coming, and Mike, like you said, there's still a lot of, like, games that just aren't that good coming out. They just wouldn't have got on Steam, and they're not selling as a result. But I think there's this weird bit where, like, tools and opportunity and cost have kind of mixed up in a way that hasn't ever happened before. And sorry, the key is exposure, and I don't mean per game. I mean to all of this as a process. So there's a lot more. We're all privy to way more information than we ever were before. So we can't actually say with any real accuracy whether this is the same as it was.
That's fair.
And there are certainly cases where you think, and I'm trying not to think of myself here, but where you just think, what went wrong there? And it's like, it's hard to tell.
Yeah.
And that lack of, that sort of gap there of that information is something that we wouldn't have even been aware of. There would have just been a gap over the whole thing, right? You're either in the top 10 charts or whatever. Yeah. And so I feel like there's this kind of perfect storm of things that are happening that people don't quite have a grasp on, because there isn't a historical precedent for dealing with it and for seeing it all happen and for it happening so quickly. And it's even down to things like, you know, people, I mean, okay, so we're talking to Mike Bithell of Bithell Games, right? But it's you know, creators are being, like, born successfully as someone with a name. So looking at like, you know, we've got Miyamoto and Mikami and Michael Ansel, but, like, they've had, like, years and years and years, and, like, Hideo Kojima, right, recently he quit and has, like, never made that much money compared to how, you know, the comparatively to the success of his games. But we get people coming out of, like, almost literally, like, nowhere / university with a successful game. And
I think it often feels that way, but I think if you look at those people, usually they've been in the trenches for a while, right?
Yeah, like, they've been doing stuff, but it's like, I guess this is combined with the fact that there are just more games now. So before, like, literally 5 years ago, their first games would never have been greenlit. They'd never have been working on them. And so what we're seeing is, like, an acceleration of everything. You know, and their, like, previous works will have been more valuable to them than the comparable ones, like, a generation before or whatever. I don't know. There's like a lot of stuff going on that I would feel uncomfortable saying, like, oh, it's always been like this, because so much of it obviously hasn't. But then we are unable, due to the nature of it, to sort of specify, well, what that actually means day to day. I think the reassuring thing is, like, whatever else happens, you have to make sure your game is worth talking about, and that only gets more and more like important. And this is why you see things like free to play becoming really accepted on platforms as hardcore as Steam. It's not necessarily because Team Fortress 2 did it, so it must be fine. It's because actually, like, studios need ways of getting people playing their games, because that's step one. And that is one, at the moment, fairly uncrowded way of doing it. You know, the competition in there's not crazy. There's whole genres without free-to-play versions of them on Steam. Not so much on mobile. But, you know, there's all these. Yeah, there you go. Big rant.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure we could talk forever on free to play, although I feel like the three of us are on the same side of the discussion, which is not very useful. But
and
I think
equally uninformed, right?
Exactly. But I think, you know, something you did bring up that's really interesting about, you know, you said you have to make something really interesting and worth talking about. And I feel like free to play does help that barrier a lot, right? It's like, you know, if I don't need to convince you to hand over your money first thing, then you're much more willing to give it a shot. Obviously, when everything is free to play, then it's another uphill battle. But yeah, it's really interesting thinking about the indie space and so on and so forth. And I think, you know, Mike mentioned these indie hits that seem to come out of nowhere. There is so much behind a lot of them. I feel like there are some games that, you know, it feels like they got a little bit lucky, or, you know, a lot of them, there's a luck component involved in all of them, but there's some of them where you seem very lucky. But, you know, there's people where I've never heard of any of their other games, but this one hits, and then I'm like, oh, it's their first game, and you look through and like, oh wow, like, you know, they've been doing stuff for ages.
Or it's
the guy who made Five Nights at Freddy's or whatever. Everyone assumed. Yeah, he's a classic example. He'd made launched 20 games or something.
Yeah. The weirdest moment I had was Noel Berry, who's a indie developer in the States. You know, I don't know how I think he was 16 or 17 when I started following him. And I was just like, what right does a 16-year-old have to be making such good games? And then I think over the weekend, he's like, oh, here's some of the games I made when I was 10, and here's some of the stuff I made when I was 12. And I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that's
started early. It's something I do a lot of. I talk to a lot of students, and it's something I always kind of. I get them to name, like, who do you think got successful with the first game? And you always get, like, Phil Fish, he worked at Ubisoft. Yeah. You know, Jonathan Blow ported Unreal Tournament's engine and then had a studio for 9 years before he made Braid. So it's like, there's always these backstories. And I think rightly so, people kind of assume that people were, you know, born into existence at the moment they first hear about them. That's very rarely the case. I think Vlambeer might be one of the few examples, actually, of a studio that those guys literally kind of dropped out of uni and their first project was Super Crate Box. So it's super rare, and it's something that I think you have to have a plan for that journey. And you see it a lot, like, you know, a lot of indies have worked in big studios, or, you know, have worked on other indie games. That's something that definitely I've seen, and I've had lots of people work for me who have then gone on and made stuff, and that's exciting to see, you know, where you're like, oh they've got their name on a few credits, they've kind of worked out what they do and don't want to do, and that helps people.
Yeah, I think there's another side of it as well, and I think Steam Spy is the worst for this, of that you start, you know, drawing this, you know, this sort of bar of like, this is sort of the success level, and you don't think about how much did this game cost to make, how
long
much
did it come out, how long
exactly.
did it come out. That's the one I love.
Yeah, because
I've seen people. The one I use an example, and I won't say which YouTuber it was, but I thought it was hilarious. As there was a YouTuber who was talking about, like, failures of games, the indie apocalypse or whatever, and they were talking about Bossa Studios. And full disclosure, I used to work at Bossa Studios, so don't trust a word I say. But they were saying that I Am Bread is a failure compared to Surgeon Simulator. And they were basing this on, they'd looked at Steam Spy, and I think Surgeon Simulator had sold over 1 million, and I think I Am Bread had sold like 300,000, something like that. So, you know,
I'd take either of those.
Exactly right. Neither of them are bad numbers, right? But what they hadn't bothered to look at was, you know, Surgeon Simulator came out 2 years ago, whereas I Am Bread had come out like in early access like 3 months ago or whatever, at the point where this video was recorded. Surgeon Simulator had been in like 4 Humble Bundles, and it had done this, and it had done that, and it had done that. And slowly, when you start cranking this stuff up, you go, oh no, I Am Bread's like massively outperforming Surgeon Simulator. I think that's the thing, this historical data, people get very confused by it, and it's you just have to ignore those those silly things. But yeah, it is something like, if you're planning to make an indie game, don't look at the Steam Spy numbers for your favorite indie game and go, oh well, if I can just do like 10% of that, because that's definitely not how it works. And I know I did the same. I remember when I was working on Thomas, I saw the release of Dear Esther, and they put out like a press release like they'd made $100,000 in the first day. And I was like, $100,000 in the first day. Oh man, if I'm like 1/10 as big as them, if I make $10 in my first day, and of course, like, you know, that's really stupid maths.
Yeah.
But I did it, and I'm sure other people do it.
Yeah.
So it's just people need to be kind of careful with their assumptions.
Yeah. Cool. I think we'll talk a lot more about being indie, the struggles of indie, and so on and so forth. Should we jump to some questions?
Yeah,
let's do it. I've
So
been
first
noticing
one,
they've been arguing a little bit in the chat.
Oh, really? I stopped my scroll so I could slowly catch up and go through the questions. So I don't know.
Find some questions in there.
Cool. So King Bobski started off with, how do you feel Microsoft, Valve, Sony, and so forth or do you think they have good post-launch support? I've worked with Sony post-launch, but
yeah, I hate all those companies that are responsible for my income. No, I can honestly say, like, and again, this is why I don't necessarily do well with these kind of. I have special treatment, so I'm treated really well. I have like lots of contact with them. They help me out. They give me advice. Loads of support. But I'm aware that that's not the common thing necessarily. But yeah, I've had an amazing experience with Sony and Valve and Microsoft and Nintendo, even with Thomas Was Alone. So yeah, it's all been very good.
Right, you add anything to add?
The general rule is. Valve have built an amazing back end with Steam and then leave you to it. And then the other guys just want anyone who shows their system off in a good light to do even better because they benefit from it. So, it comes down to that. I mean, we're looking at ports in the future for Tango, hopefully, but mostly we've just been doing Valve and my previous stuff on mobile, you know, very... Apple are a good example. They are just, you know, they're a platform holder and they will feature anything that makes their phone look good, whether it's a fun game or not. So that's what it's all about. Cool, pick and choose. Like, they'll support you. Each platform holder will have like a different opinion of why their thing is cool, and they will therefore support things that show that one thing off to the. So.
And that's very temporal, right? Like, I remember Thomas Was Alone got on Vita because at that point that was like the big thing was to try and get indie games onto Vita. So there's always something. Like right now, you know, obviously a lot of people are very excited about VR. So it's very easy to get great support if you've got a VR project, you know. So you're finding those angles that make you attractive to them. It's up to you if it's the. You know, do you specifically make something that targets what they want, or do you find the person who wants what you're making? And I would always veer towards the second one because otherwise you'll go a little bit insane. But yeah.
The flip side of that being that they might leave and then you're screwed.
That's true too.
The amount of times I've heard of and been on publisher funded projects where the sort of evangelist for it leaves and then the funding just gets dumped. You're like, what happened?
Yeah.
But it's tough.
Yeah.
Andrew, you mentioned ports. Our next question, again from King Bobski, is do you find it commercially viable to do the Steam OS and Ubuntu Linux ports?
We haven't done it yet. Mike, you've done it? Have you? Or?
We did with Thomas. We did Linux ports. I think it's a nice thing to do. Because obviously there's a lot of very passionate Linux gamers there, and they're all on Twitter. In terms of the financial viability of it, I'm not completely convinced it makes sense yet. But then you don't want to be the person that's late to it. So it's a tough one. I would suggest that's something when you've got a little bit of money to play with from a game. I wouldn't prioritize that. I would prioritize the Russian and Polish translation and maybe the first console or mobile port way higher, way further up that list than Linux. Unfortunately, just in terms of the number of users who have it, you know, Thomas has been out on Linux for years and it does some units on there, but it's definitely not something that I think is utterly necessary from day one by any means.
Yeah, I mean, I think Am I remember correctly that in order to be on a main Humble Bundle, you do need to support Linux? Is that true or not?
It used to be. I don't know if
Oh,
it's
is it
true
not anymore?
So, yeah,
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it's not anymore, and that's a
Okay.
pretty decent signifier. I mean, the numbers they do, and if they're even a bit like, you know what, it might not be worth it.
Well, they used to do it in-house as well. Like, you used to be able to go to them. We didn't do this, but you used to be able to go to them, and they would do the Linux port for you. They had, like, an in-house Linux nerd who would kind of do those ports. But I think, honestly, if you look at most historical indie games, it's probably because of Humble Bundle that there was a Linux port.
Yeah.
Like, I know with Thomas Was Alone, that's what got us to make the decision. I'm not saying we wouldn't have done it eventually of our own accord, but, like, being in Humble Bundle was definitely the reason why we did that.
Cool. Next question is from Bazan. I'm currently working at AAA studio, but I'm seriously considering going freelance for a while to get back on my feet and then go indie. Do you have any advice for advertising yourself as a freelancer? What sort of things would you guys be looking for if you're to hire someone for a period of time? So I'm a freelancer right now, and so our next episode is specifically about going indie. But I'm a freelancer right now, and I genuinely, it almost goes back to our getting into games thing. Is like it. I feel like I always need someone to vouch for me in most freelance jobs. Like I've gotten a few of them where it's just like, I interview well and I explain what I do and so on and so forth. But most jobs I've gotten, someone's there to vouch for me to say like, I've worked with him before, he's good.
You're a very specific. I think it varies by job. I'd love to know what this person does actually, because I'm in a hiring mood right now. So post what you do and post your portfolio. With coders, I think you're absolutely right. Like, I've only ever worked with coders who I've either had a personal relationship with or have known people and specifically a working relationship, not just a friendship.
Yeah.
Like, so for example, Roper worked on Volume. I knew he was good because Smithy's been working with him for so long, and Smithy doesn't work with idiots. So I felt pretty confident in bringing Roper in just because I knew of his experience. I knew the people he worked with. Honestly, I'm much more experimental in terms of the softer stuff, the designers, the artists. If I see something which wows me in terms of what they've produced, it's an interesting one. Artists specifically, like I've recruited people from Twitter. I've been, people I tend to follow a lot of artists on Twitter just so I have some pretty pictures in amongst the usual Twitter drama. And like I've then gone to those people and hired them for things. So just having a great portfolio, being very visible and noisy and sharing your art. Design, he's posted, or she, sorry, Luke, okay, is posted, he's a designer. Design's tricky because design's one of those skills, like, and I say this as someone who, worked in industry as a designer for years and years and years. Like, it's a hard thing to demonstrate skill in because it's a very vague job. It's a very it's not here's a pretty picture or here's a piece of code that doesn't break. Like, it's a very softer skill. So there it is really just about being able to demonstrate. The really interesting thing for a designer right now is, are you going to work for me as a level designer, or are you going to go and make your own games? Because if you arguably don't need me. Maybe you need me because you don't have resources or access, or even, a lot of designs I've worked with, Volume had 3-level designers, and there weren't people who they didn't want to do the whole indie studio thing. They just really love level design, and it shines through in the game because the level design's brilliant. But yeah, design's a tricky one. Design is harder because I feel like good coders are so rare and exciting that I think we're always on the lookout for them. Oh, move! Don't be humble. And then artists obviously can put razzmatazz on the internet. Yeah, designs are tricky.
It is tough. I mean, I would suggest that, I don't know where they're based, but just find local developer meetups, indie events. We're all in London, right? And there's a ton. Like, there's more than you could possibly go to every week. Yeah. The Unity often has like user groups based in big cities, and they have like free meetups. And just like whatever your speciality is, I mean, just go and meet people and make friends and contacts, and you never know where someone might end up, and you never know where a job might come from. That's super important with freelance. My sort of not useful bit of
it's being social.
Sorry, social stuff. So I got like a 1.5-year contract work with Appy Nation, a mobile publisher, through Twitter. Like, literally, I saw a tweet and responded, and obviously had like I do good Twitter as my thing. So, yeah, but like it just like as an example of you just never know where something's going to come from.
And you never know who's going to do what, right? Like I've had it before where like, you know, with Volume we had artists who I'd worked with in previous jobs, or people Danny is someone I met at Unity User Group, like you say, like you have to get out there, and that's kind of awkward if you're kind of nerdy and shy as I am. People assume I'm not, but I am. Like forcing yourself to actually put yourself out there and meet people is really important, and it sucks because it's really difficult for a lot of us. But yeah, I think that, you know, having groups of people around you from which you can find interesting people to work with. Freelance specifically, if you're using the word freelance, that implies you want to get, like, you know, paid now. So that's a smaller pool. You know, you'll have a lot of indies who'll be like, oh, we'll give you a rev share, and honestly that's a great deal if you can afford it. You know, if you can afford to not get paid for a few months, then, and their game becomes a mega hit, you know, God bless him, Dave Housden, my composer, is doing just fine from his Thomas's Alone revenue share. But that's a big ask. So if you want a salary, then honestly, there's a very small pool of studios who actually have the resources to do that. You know, and that's just finding people down the pub. They're probably going to want you to work for free, and if that's not something you can financially afford right now, then your probably best bet is to go down the recruitment line and actually try and like find a recruiter and find like a paid job in the industry. Might mean working in mobile games. That seems to be where most of the jobs are right now. But I'm opening a studio soon, so we'll do that.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'll add quickly onto that is, like, when you're doing the networking stuff, make sure you have some stories in mind of things you did that you really enjoyed and turned out really well. Because if you start working those kinds of things in conversation, next time they're like, oh, I need someone to do this thing. And if they're reminded of, oh, there's that guy that did this thing that was like this, and he seemed really happy about it, and it turned out really well. I think that goes a really long way. I think when I'm, you know, looking for someone to do something, I'm always trying to think, like, do I know anyone that does that kind of thing? But yeah.
That's really true. Like Roper specifically, I knew I needed server stuff, and he'd been regaling us excitedly about the process of doing multiplayer in Tango Fiesta. So I was like, he knows the internet. He knows how to program things on the internet. So you're absolutely right. Like, letting it be known what you do, and just having a little bit of, like, you know, pride and show off a bit. Like, frankly, that those people, there's a reason those people get ahead. It's because they put themselves out there.
Cool. Next question is from Patelachet. What do you do when it's one of those days when you're not motivated at all? Do you push yourself, or do you push your beep up, or do you do something else, like a social life thing?
I'm a bit old school. I don't stand for any of that rubbish. If you're having a bad day and you can't concentrate, go for a 5-minute walk, clear your head, come back, do some work. Or just go and do some work that you know is boring but needs to be done. Like, there's always shit that needs to be done. Sorry, I beat. There's always stuff that needs to be done. And just, it's like writer's block. It's not a thing. It's literally not a thing. You can still just write words, and eventually the right words will come out. So just the sooner you get over it, the better. Because as soon as you fall into the trap of allowing yourself to sort of get out of things, then it becomes way harder the next time that happens. People are all different, but that's just my one.
I'm going to fundamentally disagree with Smithy here. No, I think honestly it depends on who I'm working with and how many people. Like, if I'm working and, like, someone needs something from me. So a classic example would be today. Like, today there is a specific job I have to get done so I can send something to someone, and it's not done. So I'm having a late night tonight because it needs to be done, and that's how it works. And when something needs to be done, it needs to be done. So I'm with Smithy. In those situations, I'll go out and get a 5-minute walk, and I'll chill out, and I'll try and get it done. And I'll just bob my heads against the wall. The thing, though, with me, and I'm not sure how healthy this is I'm really, really like my job. So I'm okay with taking breaks. So if tomorrow I've got nothing anyone needs, so if I wake up and I'm not feeling it, I'll take the morning and go and play some Call of Duty and chill out, because I know that when I'm in the zone, I'm much more productive, and I know that I'm rubbish at taking breaks when I am in the zone. So I kind of work around that. I have an assumption that I will have X number of productive hours a week, and as long as no one needs me to be at my desk at a certain time, I'm going to be in charge of when those are best served. Because there are days where I don't feel like I'm going to be doing a great job, and those are the days to take a break, and like a more substantial break. But that varies, and if I've got even one person working with me, I tend to lock down a bit more.
I guess I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, because I am freelance part-time and then indie part-time. I find my indie time is just, it's rare enough that it's really valuable to me. But there definitely are times where it's just like I get stuck on something, or I don't, I'm not really feeling it. And I make sure to just have other, as Andrew said, there's always, some grunt work that needs to be done or something like that. But I often feel like it's easy to get back in the mood on a different task than the one that you're currently stuck on. So luckily I wear many, many hats right now, whether it's coding, writing, there's some game design stuff, there's business stuff, there's boring accounting stuff. And, there's always something that you can do that's productive. But as you said about the social life stuff, like, I think it's really important that you sort of pre-anticipate it. Like, I always make sure, that, I have, at least one, social event every other week, and, a lunch with someone every now and then, so that, like, I think it's really important when you're working on your own or working isolated that you do take time to talk to people, especially because it gets you excited about it again. It's like someone asks, how's everything going? And you explain like, oh, I did this and I did this and I did this. Or even if you're not enjoying it, you're like, oh, I did this. And then eventually, you feel like a little bit of the value of the work that you put in. So
you need to make space for it. I mean, we're the three of us as well. Like, we all live with long-term partners. So it's like that makes, like, that's almost default social. Yeah. Like, there's another human being there. But yeah, I always make an effort like to see people a couple of times a week for me, because I know I need it. I'm never in the mood. I never like, I can't wait to go out tonight. I'm always stroppy about it. And then when I'm there, I really like it. But like, yeah, it's definitely something that you need to recharge. And if you're not working in an office, because if you work in an office 9 to 5, that's sort of enough, isn't it? Like, on like a human level, like, you're socializing still, you're still talking to people. But if you are just sat in your bedroom or your living room working, and every conversation you have with people is about the work, then yeah, it can start to drain you a little bit.
Cool. Let's do two more. This one, let's be quick on, because we'll probably do an entire episode on funding. But do you have any like quick advice for someone that's sort of stuck trying to find funding for something? Specifically, they said they're stuck in limbo without the ability to generate interest due to the lack of a budget, but lacking a budget to generate sufficient interest to get investment.
I mean, the investment will hinge on having a thing. Like, you'll need to show something for it. So if you haven't got a game yet, that's tricky. There is this prototype fund things coming in, but to be honest, like, the stipulations on that, do require like that you have employees. So like, you're probably not at that. Like, it's not going to be helpful to
you only need 2, including yourself.
2 PAYE employees, which is for a lot of indies. Like, that's a big hurt. That's some accounting, right? You've got an accountant if you're doing that. Which is something that every indie should get, an accountant. But that's another topic for another day. So there are funds, but like, I would suggest that, like, honestly, in the short term, you just need to make a thing, and like, going, like, in my case, I just got a day job. I worked, and that might be the solution, is just go and work in a wherever, like a shop or something, like just something to get the bills paid. And then, I mean, for me, it very much focused me in, because I didn't want to be doing that stuff. So I was like going home every night furiously coding to get that done. But yeah, it's if you've not got a thing already and you've not got a reputation yet, then that might be tricky. I don't know, Smithy, is there other stuff I'm not thinking about?
No, I think you're probably right. I mean, it sounds a bit brutal, but yeah, if you haven't got a thing, then you need a thing, and if you have and people aren't interested, then you need to ask serious questions about the thing. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that maybe the way you're pitching it's not hitting right, or whatever. And I suppose on a more constructive side, every kind of person or body or organization that you pitch to is going to be funding for a different reason, and so you need to treat those people like different audiences. You can pitch the same game, same idea, but you will have to shift your pitch to compensate for that. It's like going for a job. or anything else where there's some sort of like transaction. Basically, you just have to think about it like, why, who are these people who would be investing? What do they want? Publishers have portfolios. Is there a hole? Are they interested in filling the hole? Whatever. There's a lot of questions that you need to ask. But yeah, if you've got a thing and it's not getting grabbed, then ask the questions and figure out why, and then fix it. It's all within your power, whoever you are.
Cool. And the last question is, do you tend to hire local people or people to work remotely?
Depends where they are. The good people. I hire good people. No, actually, Volume genuinely had people across the world. There were Americans working on it, there were British people, there were a couple of Europeans. We had an Indian lady was doing some of it. So we had lots of people all over the world. It varies by job. For example, with the next stuff we're working on, probably going to be looking at coders who will be local because we want them in the same room as each other, kind of working together. But then there's other jobs, art production, asset production in general, can be remote and can work just as well. If there's stuff which is kind of small deliverables, that's often something that can be kind of wherever. It's the people who are kind of coming in, working every day in a very blending kind of way that makes sense to have them in the same place. But yeah, no one. If someone's interesting, will make it work. In my case.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, with Tango, we had 4 people. Each was a different discipline, and that worked quite well for a remote. We didn't share an office, but as a designer, I always like working with my coders, just actually my whole team. I prefer working with them. I don't know if they feel the same, but certainly design's such a collaborative thing, and it mixes up all of the other elements, so it just you do get better work done, I think, in person. But that said, it comes back to that old return on investment. I hate that phrase, but that's we look at the cost of office space and things like that, and it's going to be a while till that's a worthy return. Basically, you can use so many wonderful tools these days to kind of approximate. It's an odd one.
Yep, I think I'm the same way. I think there's certain things that I like to do in real time, ideally in person, and I think you can start getting Skype calls and that kind of stuff. But I think there's a lot about a game that develops in that sort of chatter, that moment-to-moment chatter that you kind of lose sometimes with remote. But I definitely think there's loads of things that the more you know about it, the easier it is to do remote. And even if you don't know how or a lot about it, there are ways to make it work. I worked for a company in California for 18 months remotely, and it was originally they would send me a task, I'd get it done by the deadline and whatever, and it just felt weird. So eventually I would have an 8-hour Skype call with them every day. And then it just started feeling about right again, and it was just like, well, my job becomes easier because I know what you're doing and I can sort of riff off of it, and we can be more efficient, and we could also improve the ideas and that kind of things. That's what it sort of comes down to me.
Sounds good.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Cool. I guess that is the third show. We'll be back next week again, so Wednesday 7:30 again, and it will be about our stories going indie. In my case, I think it'll be both times I went indie, the first catastrophic time and the time that is happening now.
Which is not catastrophic.
Yet.
Which is going to be fine. It's going to be fine.
But yeah, and I guess if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're watching on Twitch, you're already probably subscribed. If you watch it on iTunes, please leave us a review because we have no reviews on iTunes. And if you're not watching on iTunes,
is that a thing?
We're on iTunes.
Wow.
And if you're not listening on iTunes, go to iTunes and pretend that you subscribe to us and leave a review. But yeah, and where can they find everyone on the internets?
Smithy?
I'm at Spilt Milk Studio. No S on the end there. Twitter's got character limits.
I'm at Mike Bithell.
And I'm at One of Moo. But I recently launched a company I'm going to plug real quick, and that's at Foam Sword Games.
Hey.
So yeah.
I'm really excited about what you guys are working on. I've seen it, and it's cool.
Cool. But yeah, I guess we'll see everyone next week. Bye.
Bye.
I need to press the hang up button. I always forget to press the hang up button.
Is this going to be every week?
This is every week. Okay, it's real this time. Ready? Wave.